You're listening to the Wedding Biz Network, the voice of the creative entrepreneur.
Come on, y'all!
Hey everyone, it's Andy Kushner, host of The Wedding Biz, and this is a new episode of The Next Level, in which I discuss the most recent interview of the week with a guest co-host, and we talk about it in such a way that can help you bring your own business to the next level. And before I introduce today's guest co-host, I want to mention that last week on Monday, I re-released one of my favorite interviews. I have so many favorites, but I re-released my part one with David Mon, an absolutely incredible designer and planner out of New York City who works worldwide. There's just so much to learn from him and to be inspired by. And so on Wednesday, I also re-released the part two interview that I had done with David. They're both really worth checking out. And so now, without any further ado, today's guest co-host is none other than Jennifer Stein. Hey, Jennifer, welcome.
Hey, Andy, how are you?
I'm good. And just in case anyone somehow has not heard you with me on the show before, Jennifer is the co-founder and editor-in-chief of Destination I Do magazine, which can be found on newsstands in all 50 states and 12 countries. And she also has a wonderful daily blog that is online and consults and custom publishes. So let me introduce the guest that we're talking about here, Jennifer, today for the listeners. And that is Morgan Childs, who first began with Moana events and Belle destination events, and then added another element by creating Modern Elopement, for which she is the CEO and creative director. Morgan has been called the elopement expert by your magazine, Destination I Do magazine. She's also a planner who started an elopement brand back in 2015 when she first saw a trend for smaller weddings happening. And of course, this concept has exploded since COVID. So, Jennifer, you recognized her well before the pandemic.
We did. And it's kind of funny. I'm wondering if Morgan has something she needs to confess to all of us, and that she's a time traveler and went back, it went forward in time to see that elopements would be all the rage and micro weddings would be all the rage for 2020. No, I'm kidding. But so back last year, really, Morgan and I've worked together. We've published her weddings multiple times through the years, and she is just a phenomenal human being, by the way. And she had actually reached out to me and said, hey, we have this Modern Elopement brand that's part of, our umbrella. And, she really was very vocal in saying, let's work together in creating something about elopements. And at the same time, I had really been seeing kind of a shift for a little while myself in, just some of reader feedback and things like that. And so I said, Morgan, I love this. And so we worked together and had, I think, a total of about 25 pages of content in our spring-summer 2020 edition. And we interviewed her as our Ask the Expert for elopements. We had an entire photo essay called Table for Two. So it was all about how to kind of, depending on wherever your elopement is, if it's in, the South, or if it's in Hawaii, or if it's, wherever, how to kind of personalize your experience and really blow it out. So it's not just like, you holding a bouquet and having an officiant, and there's really no pomp and circumstance. There was a lot of pomp and circumstance in this particular story. And so it was really fun to have Morgan kind of be a catalyst for an entire section of our magazine. And then for it to hit newsstands basically in February, and then for it to be so completely relevant unknowingly for this year. So that's kind of the history of how that went down.
That's crazy. Yeah, that's wild, the timing. And just as a little aside, you mentioned Hawaii. I mean, the fact that she grew up in Kauai, it reminds me of the interview you and I spoke about on The Next Level about Matt Porteous, the photographer, who grew up on a small island and by Britain and France. But it's interesting that she then moved to New York City. Like, how much more opposite can you get?
Yeah, she went to the opposite kind of island, I guess.
Yeah, well, she's back, though. She's back in Hawaii. Not in Kauai, but she's in Honolulu. But yeah, it's like you say, the fact that she saw this trend for smaller weddings already starting a few years ago and having such different expectations and describing or giving the definition. I tell you, Jennifer, I needed help with the description of micro wedding, mini wedding, pop-up wedding, sequel wedding, on and on and on and on. And so she really helped to clarify that. And then we got into pricing. and that's where I'd like to sit for a minute with you and talk about that. She was saying that she still is spending a lot of hours. And so we've got to keep in mind that it still requires the time and energy to produce a nice experience. However, she did form and brand another division for elopement weddings, which has an abbreviated and more simple experience at a lower price point. And she was saying how they simplified the back end and now, can plan in 8 to 15 hours versus 250 hours. So, she can take on a lot more on top of her full service weddings. What did you think about that whole issue?
Well, and I think it's brilliant, first of all, that she recognized kind of this movement and shift in her business. And instead of just saying, which is so tempting to just give in and say, oh, well, I love these, because she clearly loves the smaller intimate weddings and really wanted to service this group. But she also recognized the need for, her revenue stream. And I think it's really interesting because right now, so many planners are having to plan the same wedding over and over and over again. Right. And their guest list has gone from 150 people to 35 people. And the planning, when you really treat it the same way, it's the same amount of work for 35 people as it is for 150 people, with maybe the exception of, floral design, just because you've got more tables and things of that nature. But the trappings are the same. And I think it's really interesting that Morgan was like, you know what? This is a shift in my business. I love it. I'm passionate about it. Let's create something where the expectation meets the revenue. And I think that's so basic, but yet kind of revolutionary, if you will, because it's like, I think in our industry, we're a service industry. So it's all about service. It's all about, working towards this event. And I think so often it's really tempting to give things away and not charge for them.
Yeah.
And I think what's good is that she's like, listen, I'm going to give you something, but the expectation is following with what I've lined up the revenue to look like. And expectations, I think there was many, the next levels ago, we talked about Rishi and how Rishi Patel, it's all about expectation for him and his client. And that's how he kind of works towards making sure that his client and him and their visions are aligned. And it's very similar with what Morgan's talking about, where it's, what she's giving is less, but it also costs less. So it works together. I mean, it's so simple, but yet it's so tempting to not, for people to just not charge for their time.
Do you want to hear behind the scenes stories of some of the most influential music industry pros around? Check out my other podcast, The Music Makers. You can find the show on your cell phone's podcast app or at themusicmakers.com. Again, that's The Music Makers. What do you think about the issue of, I think I asked her something about, are you concerned, Morgan, about blocking the calendar with so many more of these lower price point weddings and blocking the opportunity to do, what she's still doing, these full service high-end weddings? What did you think about that?
Well, I think that's a really smart question to ask and it's something that is, again, so tempting because right now, so many planners, so many photographers are like, well, photographers are a little bit different just because their fee is their fee, regardless of how many people they're photographing. Yeah. So they're a little different. But with wedding planners, it's like, you don't want to schedule all these dates for these small weddings and bypass the ability to have these higher profile events. But at the same time, if the higher profile events aren't able to happen, and then you also say no to the smaller events, where are you at then? You get nothing. So I think it's just depending on how someone's company is set up. If there are, junior associate planners that can take on.
That's right. Who can do those? Yeah.
The smaller events that maybe, those kind of backfill and then, fingers crossed for these larger, high profile, high revenue kind of events. I think she's really smart to truly treat her businesses differently the way she does and the way she schedules them, who she's putting on, each task and whatnot. So I think first of all, it's a really good question to ask, Andy. And then second of all, I love how she's handling it personally.
Also she believes that this trend for smaller weddings is going to continue post-COVID. What do you think about that? What are you seeing and hearing?
Oh, I could not agree more. And it's interesting because I know that the pandemic has definitely played an enormous role in that, but I also think it was kind of headed in that direction anyway. I think, especially for destination weddings, I think things were starting to get a little crazy, not crazy, but I think, when you look at the number of guests, when we first started the magazine in 2005, the average number of guests for an international destination wedding was like 25 people. Now it's like 75 people. I mean, it's tripled.
Yeah.
And that's not a bad thing. It's just that, and the number of destination weddings has gone up. I mean, think about 15 years ago, how many destination weddings you were invited to and how many weddings in the last 3 years, destination weddings you've been invited to. So it's like, I do think that it was starting to get to a point where it was almost the norm. And the request for a guest to go to a destination wedding is much higher than a local wedding. You've got to travel. You've got to take time off work. You've got to budget for it. You're traveling. So I think it's actually interesting to me. I also think it's interesting on who is paying for the wedding.
Right.
That's had a major shift.
Yeah.
And so couples that are like, listen, I'm, in my late 30s, I found the one, we're getting married, and we're going to pay for it because we don't want mom's golfing buddies to have to be invited.
Right.
Like, we don't even know them. We don't spend time with them. Why would we want them at our destination wedding or at our wedding in general? Doesn't even have to be destination. And so the couples, when you look at the spending trends and who is paying for the wedding, it is no longer mommy and daddy.
Right. And that's been going on for years, that trend, that shift.
Exactly. And I think that's happening more and more. And so the more we see it, the more we see a trend towards the intimate, smaller weddings, because that's how people enjoy traveling right now. I mean, you think about the boom of private home rentals and people wanting a home away from home. They want to be with their group of people. And, they're not necessarily, apologizing for that. They're like, listen, this is what I envision. I want it to be a party from start to finish. I want us to have a vacation together. A lot of them are even doing it at resorts and taking out like a section of the resort or like the residential section if they've got it. And, so I think it just completely speaks to what's already been happening. But the pandemic has just kind of concentrated that desire because of necessity. People can't have 150 guests right now. They just can't. And if they do, they're shamed to the end, the nth degree, or they're just, the cops are getting called. Nobody wants that on their wedding day. I mean, unless you're just partying too hard, that I get. But for having just too many people in a space, I really think we have to tread really carefully there. And so these smaller, intimate weddings are right now the answer. And I think they will be for at least a couple of years. And I do think they're a part of our industry that might be here to stay.
Well, she mentioned too, you can have a huge group of people and spend less per person versus less people and treat them way better too. You could provide more of an experience. And like you say, couples are now valuing things really differently. More of what you were saying, like Morgan made the example, maybe they want to put more down on the down payment of a house or whatever. And especially this experience with COVID, dealing with it. And so they are getting more savvy about how they spend their money, and that's going to last.
Well, and you have to look too right now at what companies are doing really well. Zoom is like, you buy stock in Zoom, man, you're like loaded right now. If you're looking at, home decor companies, they're going bananas because people are home. And our culture in the United States is very like what's directly in front of us right now. And so, the fact that a lot of couples are like, what's in front of me right now? I need a smaller group of people for my wedding. What does that do for my budget? Does it reduce it to the point where I really do have a down payment on a house? because it would be a lot nicer to be in quarantine in a house than it would in this tiny little apartment.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
So people are they're thinking through those things. And, to be honest with you, I don't know that that's going to be the case forever, but I do think it's going to be the case for a while.
Yeah, I think we need to really, acknowledge, not more than acknowledge, we need to embrace this and make adjustments in our companies because, like you say, I believe this is going to last for at least a couple of years too. I think it's bringing us to a place where we would have been, but it just would have taken longer. It would have been some years, and now it's sped it up in so many respects. Using technology too. All of that. It's interesting, Jennifer. I talk to friends of mine and my brother who he's in film and TV and he goes to LA a lot. And he and lots of friends of mine are saying, I'm just going to do more Zoom appointments. I mean, I miss being in person with people. I do think, especially for me as an interviewer, there's something special about that. At the same time, though, making use of technology like we've been forced to and working out of our homes there's no question it's going to last. And I think it's going to be tougher. I'm kind of going into another topic here, but it's going to be tougher to say, yeah, let me get on a plane and go have a meeting.
Yeah, I do. I think people it's going to make them stop twice, and think about, hey, does it make sense for me to be away from my family? We've all had concentrated family time. And it's funny. It's nice. I took my first plane trip that I don't even know what to call it. That's how foreign it is to me. I'm like, what is it called? A flight. That's right.
That's what yeah.
I have not been on an airplane since January.
Jeez.
And that is the longest time I have gone without traveling since I was probably in college. I'm not lying. Like it just is crazy. And when I got on my flight and I was, sitting there and I was like in my hazmat suit.
Right. Goggles, mask, two masks.
Oh yeah. I mean, like looking at everyone, like my husband said, everything you touch is fire. That's the way you have to look at it. So if you touch something, it's fire. But anyway, a day into my trip, I was missing my kids like I've never missed them before because I've not been without them at all. Like I've not traveled in 10 months, 11 months. And it's like, So I do think it's going to make people kind of stop and go, do I need to make this trip? Do I need to be away from my family? And, I also think the office space, this is not a good time to work for like a commercial real estate firm trying to sell office space because talk about a difficult sell.
It's going to be tough. Well, that is all we have time for today. I want to thank everyone for listening and be sure to check out Morgan's websites, which is modernelopement.com and moanabelle.com, MOANABELLE.com. Her social media handles are the same, Moana Belle Events, or rather it is a little bit different, Moana Belle Events and Modern Elopement. And then Jennifer, I want to give the site for everyone to find you, and that would be destinationido.com. From what I understand, your blog is at destinationido.com/blog. People can find you on Facebook at Destination I Do Mag, also Twitter, Pinterest. And then for Instagram, it is Destination I Do. Is Destination I Do for Instagram or also Twitter and Pinterest?
Also Twitter and Pinterest.
Okay, great.
That pesky Facebook screwed us up.
Yeah, I know. I've been through that. So, but everyone can go to the show notes at theweddingbiz.com and get all of this information right there. And Jennifer, thank you again for doing this. It's always so much fun, to have you on the show.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Andy. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and I want to mention that next week's episode is going to be filmmaker Caleb Jordan Lee. Very interesting interview. Everyone should be sure to tune in. And we'll catch you next week on The Wedding Biz.